Today, I looked at my calendar and I noticed that we needed to have a talk, folks. It's not an easy talk to have. It's the sort of talk that any complex games apologist needs to have with his audience about the elephant in the room. Oh, you mean it's not this Duplo elephant? Oh. So today we're going to talk about GURPS. And there's a remote possibility that there might be a couple viewers here on the channel for whom the initials of that acronym might be something new. So here it is. It stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. And I guess you might be wondering, do I really think it is any of those things? And you might be wondering what I think it's good at. You might be thinking, well, what is it about your backstory in the RPG hobby, CGA, which leads you to not play a great deal of GURPS? And I am going to answer some of those questions. I hope not to hurt any feelings, but consider this your content warning because the gloves are off. Yeah, I'm not wearing them. Our story begins in the early 1990s at a small-town hobby shop on Main Street, the sort of place that you can't find anymore, where remote-controlled cars shared shelf space with LED miniatures and publications by TSR and other role-playing hobby publishers. This was a strange environment where individual salespeople approached customers and pitched their various own hobbies and tried to sell people on what they had a great affection for. The young boy was looking for Mystara, which was the apple of his eye, a setting without compare. Its hexagons and its detail fascinated him. He'd thrown out his basic D&D rulebook a few years ago because it was too embarrassing in the aftermath of the Satanic Panic. He was looking to get back into D&D now that he was a little bit more grown up. But lo, he started asking questions about what he needed to play. He was looking at that Karamikos box set. But the salesman said, "Now see here, kid, you're going to have to buy this Player's Handbook, and you're going to have to buy this Dungeon Master's Guide, and you're going to have to buy the basic setting, and look at all these splat books that you're going to have to buy before you can even play. And then here's this module in this box set that, you know, it's probably pretty great, but I mean, it's up to you. Maybe you'd like to buy this soft cover book that has everything you need to play in it, in so many different genres." Needless to say, as a youngster, I was easily convinced. My dad often made visits to the hobby store for his own historical miniatures wargaming hobby on his way home from work, and occasionally he would bring me the latest tomes from this role-playing game, which I occasionally had some success at getting my friends to make characters in. And over the years, I got more and more familiar with the rules and maintained a strong affection with them, which I'll talk to you about why I thought that GURPS was great. And at some point, I got to run several full-fledged campaigns and really understand the personality of the system. And that's where I learned a few things. I'm going to let this little passage, which I often quote from our good friend Runeslinger, open the tale of where my reflections upon GURPS began to show cracks in the wall.
Genre is rule 0. Now, rule 0 is typically defined as you can change anything you like if it's not working for you. And why I say genre is actually rule 0, it's because what you like or what you're enforcing in play, well, that's genre. What you are laying down as the mood or experience at your table in terms of how you play, how you role play, how the mechanics work, which mechanics are included. That all creates, at the end of the day, genre.
My experience of play was a little bit apart from what I imagined before I began play. Now, the meaning of genre is rule zero is not to say that everything you do at the table must cleave to genre conventions and that this should be the first thing in your mind, in the same way that
The Game Master is God.
is rule zero in some people's books, and change anything you want, who cares, the rules don't matter, is other people's impression of what rule zero is. System matters. For Runeslinger, this postulate of genre is rule zero is meant to claim that system matters and the way that you play matters, and that the product of play is genre. You form the genre that you're going to have at the end of the day by all the inputs of the game. This means that, of course, if the party acts in a gonzo fashion and discards all notion of stealth in a Dungeons & Dragons dungeon crawl, then it will be quite a different experience from something like a Solid Snake Metal Gear Solid experience. Those are two different genres where the system might be the same, but the inputs from the players and the game master can change what the product of play is. Now, system can matter also, because after all, where you spend your time and where the camera of the gameplay lies has a great deal to do with what you experience. Now, GURPS makes a claim that it is generic and universal in some sort of way, where it's ecumenical. It can embrace all genres. It can tell the stories and record the transcripts of all different manner of adventures, pulpy to gritty, science fiction to Stone Age. And it's true that within the pages of these somewhat fragile softcover tomes, which are illustrated in a somewhat haphazard fashion, which can only be explained as it was the 90s, that within those pages you can find every enumerated angel upon a head of a pin to describe characters and technologies and sometimes monsters in all those different settings. So what is it about GURPS which begins to assert itself? In the same way that people like to say that Dungeons & Dragons is not necessarily fantasy, but it is a genre unto itself, one that dwells on zero to hero, high fantasy, magic, and, of course, something of a Mary Sue aspect to its protagonists in the modern day time. According to some, well, the bedrock of GURPS system asserts itself in several ways. The first is that the combat system is second by second in a very literal fashion, where we might be used to the idea that the 6-second round in Dungeons & Dragons is a sort of an abstract quantization. It's however long it takes to make a move and an attack. It's however long it takes to swing a broadsword or cast a spell, and it happens to be 6 seconds within our imagining. Or, in Fantasy Flight Star Wars, what you do on your turn is entirely elastic as far as what it means in terms of clock time. It could take up to a minute of blaster fire exchanging across long range, little bolts arcing across the trenches on the open, icy fields of Hoth for one hit to be scored. Or it could be a fast-paced lightsaber combat where each round, each lock of the blades is a roll of the dice, or an exhortation to join me on whichever side of the force you prefer, might be a social check which preoccupies a character's turn in Fantasy Flight Star Wars. However long it takes to do what you've chosen to do is how long your turn is. That's deeply abstracted, but in a fun way. Suffice it to say, GURPS is not like that. Each and every second of combat is a given character's round. During combat in GURPS, each and every second that a character is acting is a round or turn for that character. On your turn, you can choose to pull out your gun, or you can aim your gun, or you can fire your gun, or you can move. There's no action economy in the conventional sense with GURPS, where you might be able to do more than one thing on your turn. Except that there is sometimes, if you know how to apply the rules in a clever way, or you're playing at a cinematic and pulpy level, at which point it takes an extra amount of time to invoke those special rules to play in a cinematic and pulpy fashion, which then takes even more session time and real life time in order to perhaps do an acrobatic dodge or to combine several actions into the space of what would be 1 second from the character's point of view. And this is not the end of how GURPS really focuses a lot of session time and play time on minute fashions of the tick of the clock. And that's because every time you need to roll the dice in GURPS, you're going to need to roll 3 die 6 and add up the result and then check it against your current effective skill level, which could include modifiers. You will occasionally need to calculate your margin of success. In an opposed roll, you will need to compare your margin of success versus the opponent's margin of success. In GURPS, when you choose to fire a gun, you can double or triple tap the trigger or even fire a burst in the space of that 1 second round. You can experience the thrill of spraying an Uzi across the room, some bullets landing in between the two opponents that you engage. That said, it's going to take some die rolls. It's going to take some calculations.
We should be getting along to 10 forward. We're going to be late for the concert.
But wait, there's more! Another aspect of combat in GURPS is that each time you roll and succeed on an attack, your opponent can invoke an active defense. They get their own 3 die 6 roll under sort of roll to try and negate the attack. Afterwards, you can roll a large handful of d6s and be responsible for summing the result. Imagine rolling 7 die 6 and adding up what your total is, then subtracting the opponent's damage resistance value. That is the number of points of damage the opponent has now taken. Your opponent may now need to make a health roll and roll under their health, else they become stunned, drop their weapon, or fall to the ground. Now, all of this can, in a gritty environment like a real war, something like Black Hawk Down, the role-playing game, amount to a very genre-authentic death spiral, a deadliness, a very quick stochastic combat where perhaps it only lasts a couple rounds. But the more that you reach for supers, for pulp, for anything that is anywhere heroic or strongly competent, the slower it can become. The next thing about GURPS that often would get my expectations out of sync with reality when it came to the product of play as genre versus what I may have imagined was that there's a kitchen sink phenomenon, in that GURPS has literally everything in its books, and players are responsible for making their characters, and they love to come up with innovative and interesting character concepts, to think of interesting ways to spend their character points. And what do you know? You can very quickly have something like a superpower in a Marvel or X-Men sense, where someone's shooting bolts of ice out of their fingertips, and this could be in a science fiction space opera environment. Now, that's perfectly fine. That could be a very interesting kind of space opera. But when you put 5 people around a table together, and they're each maybe pulling at the furthest reaches of what they imagine a genre to be, the more that this can pull things in different directions. And the game master is ultimately the person responsible for this and restricting all the options and beating the players with a no, 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 no stick. Because these are all official options, aren't they? After all, how much have we heard from the 2 guys at WebDM about they maybe resent game masters that don't allow homebrew or third-party content?
But
Yeah.
if you're just at home, a cousin to the Rules as Written DM is the Only Official Books DM.
Oh, yes. Only official. No homebrew whatsoever.
But until I really found my feet and had a lot of confidence to say no in GURPS, what happened was that the genre that I experienced and saw in play was much more gonzo and incohesive than I was hoping for. Sort of like the difference between Farscape and Andromeda or Firefly, as, you know, sort of wide open science fiction versus tightly conceived and a narrow but very interesting and focused version of science fiction. Now I have shelves of GURPS books. I could do weight training with these paperback babies of the 90s. And so there must be something about these games, these supplements, this totality of what GURPS is that brought me back and kept me enthusiastic. Because it's, after all, not like my dad was reaching into the bargain DVD bin for these things. They were gifts that I really appreciated and that preoccupied a great deal of my adolescent life. So what is it that GURPS is good at? Well, it's good at mapping out a setting. It's good at calibrating all of its dials and enabling the game master to name all the angels that are on a head of a pin. To talk about how this particular graph tank has sloped armor that allows it to deflect conventional armor-piercing rounds, whereas its competitor is hyper-focused on an ablative solution, and its laser armament is only narrowly competitive with its Gauss counterpart in its opponent. You have the facilities to get down and dirty with GURPS and really describe things on a very granular level. You can enumerate how the hours of training for basic soldiers in different armies results in different skill sets. And this made GURPS a very attractive venue for describing the original Traveller universe. Lauren Wiseman was brought in to Steve Jackson Game and was the line editor for GURPS Traveller. And I really got to learn a lot about a version of the Traveller universe that was kind of cast in amber and remembered perhaps the best days of that setting, and was able to talk about the setting in a kind of detail that had never been achieved in other forms. Because after all, these books are kind of big. They got a lot of stuff in them. And the stuff that the books have in them has the same sort of literalist, specific, statistical kind of feeling to it. They want to tell you things that matter and are quantitative about the worlds that they're describing. And this can even include swashbuckling and fun worlds like the world of the Scarlet Pimpernel.
They seek him here. They seek him there. Those Frenches seek him everywhere.
But I do have to tell you that all of that describing and enumeration that the system can achieve is done within the landscape of die 6 dice for any random element, any multiple of die 6. Sometimes you'll be rolling 5 die 6 and multiplying the result by 10. Notwithstanding the question of whether all that is tedious, which I think is in the eye of the beholder, my own experience of all that is not as negative when I look back as you might think, but it carries a certain cast. My memories of playing the combat system of GURPS are memories of bullet time action. They are freeze frames. They are things like the Matrix, like the slow motion wound shot in Three Kings, where the bullet penetrates into the flesh and we see the squicky blood and the vacuum of gas behind it, and the lethality, the pure death that a 5.56 millimeter round going into a lung means. That's what I remember about GURPS, is all of that detail in combat led to something very granular in terms of how a camera in a motion picture would see it. This is the sort of action that you might see in a kung fu film, where each sweep of the hand is an expression of the character's styles. Lotus versus Crane kung fu expressed in intricate detail in the game's mechanics. After all, martial arts is maybe one of the most exciting supplements that I can recall having laid my fingers on in GURPS. And to my mind, spending all that time with all that detail means that that becomes the genre, the detail itself. In many ways, how the films that I just talked about have a certain genre that is concerned with that, rather than other aspects of action or character. And this isn't to say that GURPS is a wargamer system. It's not to say that you cannot abide in your character's point of view, but the moment-by-moment decisions of what your character can choose to do are on this kind of scale that is not sweeping, it's not operatic. It is instead very granular, very real, sometimes very frightening. I think GURPS could be a great avenue to play something in the Cthulhu mythos, even to this day. I might do it tomorrow, because fear is very real. The choice between running and shooting is very consequential. The possibility of tripping as you scramble up the stairs from a cultist-infested basement is a very terrifying prospect, because you can witness every step that the cultists scramble up the stairs and drag you back down to their waiting blades. You can witness each and every step of that and document it in the rolls of the dice. And that could be one way of enacting genre. But my experience is that GURPS has a genre. It is not generic, and it is not universal. It is zoomed in, bullet time, detailed, granular, and ultimately something which only suits a certain set of tastes, and something which does take more time to do kind of simple things than other systems take, because it's less abstract. That's fine in its own way, and it can suit a certain kind of tastes, as I've certainly said dozens of times in this video. GURPS chose not to change when it went to 4th edition, and I don't know if it will ever see a 5th. It's resisting the prospect of a system reference document that could allow outside authors and publishers to get under the hood with the system and change certain things. It has stuck to its guns when it comes to 3-die-6 and no other kinds of dice. And you do have to add up these dice every time you roll them. And you do have to use modifiers, and you do need to check your margin of success more than a little bit. Because you're rolling 3-die-6, the actual individual particles of how your probability of success is changing versus different modifiers is not wholly transparent. It's hard to really understand how a -2 could be different based on what your target number is. And when you're so zoomed into your character's point of view and you're having to decide between firing 1 bullet or 2 or just ducking behind cover, it does seem like that's a sort of a place where there are differing directions that the system is pulling you in, where you can't know exactly, well, you can if you're a math genius, what your chances are, but you really do need to do the right thing to survive moment by moment. So GURPS isn't really a G or a U, but it is an RPS, and it certainly has been a canvas upon which so many amazing authors have brought their tools to the trade and pushed out amazing setting books, which introduce the sort of worlds that you might not see under any other publisher's umbrella. Callahan's Cross-Time Saloon, which documents the setting of Spider Robinson's novels, which are sort of like a gonzo Cheers of science fiction time travel. Those novels would never be known to me, or its rich and kind of really endearing setting, if I hadn't found the Callahan's Cross-Time Saloon source book on a shelf somewhere in a flea market circa 2002. And I wouldn't have the abiding love of the Traveler universe that I have today if it weren't for the amazing chops of the people who created the GURPS Traveler setting. And it's within the lines of code that GURPS provided that I really started to imagine that vast world of the Third Imperium and all those little space trucking freighters with crackling speakers and a country music song with banjos playing, hustling across the space lanes with 20 head of cattle mooing in the cargo hold. Those places would never have come to life in my imagination if it weren't for GURPS. And so I'm really thankful. But unless I am looking to play something which really has a kung fu focus, or perhaps is a horror one-shot, which is very focused on the blood and the escape and the terror, or something like a frontline combat adventure, either in World War II or the present day, I'm not sure that GURPS is something that I will pull off the shelf all that often. But I will be pulling off its amazing supplements and reading them, because they are full of amazing worlds to discover. So if you'd like to see more content like this, some videos where we discover the amazing world of Callahan's Crosstime Saloon, or the GURPS time travel settings, which are some of the gnarliest time travel campaign ideas that I've ever laid eyes upon, then, why don't you hit that subscribe button? Why don't you hit that like button? Share these videos. Maybe I'll have a Patreon up someday that's actually in the kind of shape where I will be excited to panhandle. But let's get the channel growing. Let's make more stuff happen. And let's remind people that there are games besides D&D. And maybe also play D&D because it's good too. Thanks. Have a good one.